My content is all about drawing weapons in their most basic form and turning them into something better. But what if they could have other forms later on? Here's what I mean.
So when I'm not drawing, I spend my free time playing video games, mainly RPGs. And those games always have a level up system recording your experience when fighting monsters. But nowadays, it's not just the characters you play that can increase their level. They're sometimes applied towards armor, accessories, and the main focus of this channel, weapons. Not to mention a brand new form once they grow stronger. Of course, you'll have to collect the drop items needed to make that happen. And let me ask you, what's a better weapon to power up first than the classic sword? Well, simple answer to that question, none. So if you haven't skipped this already, hit the subscribe button and let's start drawing. Okay, so before I started recording this video, I made this pretty awesome graph to help separate each sword by their level of quality, and as you can see, there's only one quality listed so far, which is poor. And in case you're wondering why these two are blank, it's because I have other videos planned for them. Now, in order for the sword to fit, I first used my classic pencil and ruler to lay out what seemed right. And if you're curious about the measurements, I have them labeled right here on screen. So if you want to pause the video and write them all down, be my guest. Oh, and if you think the measurements don't line up with what's recorded, don't worry, it'll all make sense later. But what do you say we pick up the pace? Okay, now that the layout's done, we can move on to some real drawing, starting with the pommel. You know, the bottom end of the sword that just seems to be there for no apparent reason. I start by drawing two diagonal lines going down from the center. I erase the very line that's going down the pommel so it's no longer in the way. Afterwards, I add a curve connecting the corners that are parallel from each other. And finally, I erase what's left, and now I have a pretty decent pommel. Next on the list is the sword's grip. I can fairly say that the work done here was a bit simpler than it was for the pommel, meaning that it consists of erasing that middle line again, and afterwards drawing a bunch of curved lines spaced out to resemble a strap wrapped around the base. Although not involving the ruler to keep the spacing more even was pretty tough. Trust me, you'll see what I mean by that in just a few seconds. You see? Right there. This is why rulers exist for a reason. Now for the crossguard, this one actually consists of a little bit more perspective. And by that I mean 1 point perspective. Yeah, okay, not my best joke there. But anyways, I draw a line under the top line of the rectangle as you see here, and from both endpoints I connect them to the bottom line to form a trapezoid. And before I do any erasing of the layouts I no longer need, I decided to extend the blade a little so that the base looks like it's connected at the hilt. Now you can see it looks more like a sword instead of two rectangles touching each other at the edge. Alright, now before I can move on, I go on adding a blade collar to the sword. And to my fellow weapon lovers, you know that these are usually seen on Eastern swords, like the katana or the Chinese Dao, for instance. But I thought it makes sense to have one for a space that seemed a little, well, bland. But all in all, it really seems to be coming together. Okay, I think it's safe to say we made it through all the hard stuff, but I think it's time we hurry over to the main focus of the sword, which is none other than the blade. Now remember when I talked about the measurements not lining up? Well, this was what I was talking about. The length of the blade seemed a bit too long, so I cut 2 inches and made it an even 6. That way the hilt wouldn't appear to look so small compared to the blade's size. But to be sure that the length was right, I drew in the point before erasing what wasn't needed. For more details, I figured of adding something extra to the blade center. You might have seen swords with a sort of long groove over the flat surface. Well, I looked it up myself, and apparently it's known as the fuller. By measuring out the center line, I can tell how long the fuller should be. Just need to make sure I leave space between both ends within the blade. Next, I draw smaller lines going across the center, each one about 1/8 of an inch long. That way, it's easy to draw 2 more lines that are evenly spaced out on each side. Trust me, I know. Every time I do that resulted in me having to erase and start over. It's so frustrating. Okay, we finally have the sword's outline done. Now it's time for the next step. And no, it's not going to be shading it all in just yet. What I'm talking about is taking a piece of rubber eraser and dab it all over the sword. Now, I know you're thinking, why are you erasing all that work? Well, it's so that I can skip past all the constant erasing to make room for more details. And those details happen to be the dents, cracks, and rust you'd expect on an old sword. It might also help to redraw some aspects that were erased earlier, like how I reapplied dark lining to the grip so I know exactly what to add where. And I can decide which parts of the strap should have tears within the lining. But best to leave some spaces blank so it doesn't seem like I overdid it with the details. And with that aside, we reach to a point where perspective comes back into play. Meaning I have chunks of the crossguard broken off from battles long ago, as you can see here. Plus it doesn't hurt to add a few signs of rusting as well. And I think that's just about it for the hilt. Oh, before I forget, I should also add the same elements to the blade color as well. But seeing how small this area appears to be, it doesn't look like I need to do much. There are times when I come across details, like the blade's filler for instance, needs some minor changes. Watch as I bring it closer to the base, then I distance it away from the point. I did it because the space between them seemed a bit too short. But with that now fixed, we're okay to keep adding details. Basically, it's what I'd done for the hilt, except some areas are more noticeable this time, like edges of the blade chipped off, or larger signs of rust after being exposed to moisture. Now, I can go on about which detail to put where, but I think it's time we picked up the pace. Okay, with things now slowing down, I want to explain to you guys about the next step, which will be shading. I start things off by working on the blade first, and I had to do it really lightly so it looked as if light was reflecting off the surface. Not to mention keep my hand from making any unnecessary smudges. Now for blending, I recommend using a paper towel. I think it helps provide a more even level of shade towards most areas, like how I darkened this half of the blade to create a more authentic use of shadow. Sure, it looks messy at first, but thanks to this paper towel, I can make it seem even cleaner. The fuller, though, is a more special case in terms of shading, meaning that I had to retrace its outline before penciling in a lighter tint than what I did for the blade. And after a little blending, I added another layer around the side to cast an even darker shadow. Keep in mind that you need to remember which direction the light is casting from in this case. Otherwise, it just doesn't look right and you'll have to start over. Okay, now before I do any more shading, I went and darkened some areas in the cracks and rust. Although this step seems simple enough, so how about we fast forward this? Alright, with that out of the way, we can move on with shading the hilt. And finally, we've reached the last step, which is coloring. Yeah, I said it, coloring. The one thing that eludes an artist like me who draws in black and white. But the colors for the rest, because I figured it's an easier pace to using new techniques. And since it's just a small detail, a mistake made is hardly noticeable, to say the least. Ugh. Starting with a rusted sword in a game is never easy. But luckily, this is a YouTube channel, so there's no need to worry about stuff like that. As an artist, however, I'm actually pretty proud that this sword turned out this way. Although, is it weird for me to be saying that? Well, it really shouldn't matter. It's my work, and I'm happy with it either way. Also, to those who aren't subscribed yet, I highly consider that you hit the red button down below. Because with that, you'll be the first to know when new content is coming up. But if you're in need of a new video right now, I highly recommend you watch this one right here, because it beats searching through all other content that's out there. Trust me, I know.